Thank you, Sarah. Michael Franz is Professor of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College, where he has taught since 2005. Franz also served as chair of the Government Department at Bowdoin from 2013 to 2017. He specializes in campaigns and elections with a specific focus on campaign finance and political advertising. As part of his research, he co-directs the Wesleyan Media Project, which tracks and codes political ads on television. In 2016, 2018, and 2020, Franz worked with ABC News as part of their decision desk, helping the network project the outcome of congressional elections on election night. His most recent book is Political Advertising in the United States, published in 2016. In his talk today, Political Advertising in the 2020 Election, Some Initial Results, Franz will take a high-level look at the 2020 results and take a deeper dive into political advertising during the campaign, including presidential and congressional races. Franz lives in Brunswick with his wife Laura and two young boys, Charlie and Henry. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I can't see anybody, but it is good to virtually see folks. And thank you to Tom for the introduction, Sarah for the invite, and to all of you for coming today. I'm working from home, and so I have my two boys, as Tom mentioned, learning in the other room, and so you may hear them scream on occasion if they are not excited about completing a math assignment or something, and so my apologies for that. I also have arranged my computer so that it shows some books in the background, even though all of my political science books are in my office on campus, and none of these books that you see behind me have anything to do with politics. They're mostly Berenstain Bears books and so forth. But it's an environment that we're all learning to get used to, and I've been teaching this way for most of the semester now, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of the research that I've been working on. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about campaign advertising in the 2020 elections. And so I'm just going to call up my presentation, and this will be our sort of companion through the talk. Let me just get it running. Okay, and so the focus of my talk today is going to be on the things that I list in this slide, which is a lot of the sort of top level main ideas that come from the research we've done on campaign advertising in 2020. This includes things such as a record year for spending in campaigns, the apparent continued dominance of TV as a medium for reaching voters, a variance in the sort of ways in which the COVID-19 issue appeared in campaigns. And one of the main lessons we're learning also is that Democrats were big spenders in particular, and spent a lot more than Republicans did in many races. And it didn't appear to make that much of a difference in any of these campaigns. And we'll see some evidence of that. And then one of the things I'm interested in my own research is a focus on outside groups, the sort of non-candidate, non-political party spending that is increasingly dominant in campaigns. So I'm going to talk about all of those issues, and I won't talk much about other aspects of the campaign, primarily because there's plenty to talk about with spending and TV ads. But I'm happy to answer anything that appears or is on your minds about the campaign, if I can answer it. This was a record year for spending, and we track at the Wesleyan Media Project campaign advertising on television and in digital settings. And so I'm going to talk a lot today about advertising on broadcast TV. Now, broadcast TV is what we're all familiar with, the sort of free over-the-air television that we watch when we watch local news, or we watch television programs on ABC, CBS, or NBC, or a local Fox affiliate. And this does not include advertising on what we might call local cable stations. If you're watching ESPN or my favorite these days, Hallmark Christmas movies, those would count as cable advertisements. And I'll have some data for us to see about that. But most of what we talk about in our project is the local TV. And local TV, local broadcast TV rather, is the dominant form at which campaigns advertise on television. So this is this first graph, is a summary measure of how many ads were on broadcast television stations across the country. This was surprising for me because in 2020, we expected to see the beginning of a decline in broadcast television advertising, primarily because it seemed to us that TV or candidates and other political advertisers would switch to digital platforms more so. But they really didn't in 2020. They continued to sort of expand their digital presence, but also put a tremendous amount more advertisements on broadcast television stations. And you can see here, these are numbers through October 25th. We're continuing to do the analysis of advertisements through the end of the election, November 3rd. And so some of the data I have here will take us through November 3rd, and some takes us to October 25th, because the analysis is ongoing. But through October 25th, there were over 5 million airings of television ads on broadcast television stations across the country in federal races. Now, it's really hard for me to convey to you that sense of scale, except to say that it's around double what we saw in 2018 and 2016. And that alone is a significant increase. But this truly is an astronomical increase. And just to give you a sense of that, if you took every single one of these ads that aired, and these are not all unique ads, they're advertisements that might air 20 or 30 times, and I'm sure you all have plenty of experience watching television and seeing the same ad over and over and over again. Well, if you took each one of those individual airings, each one of those 30-second spots, and you were to take all 5+ million of them and watch them back to back, imagine trying to do that, where you watched every single airing of an ad, even if it aired 10,000 times, watching it 10,000 times, every campaign ad across federal races from 2019 through November or October 25th, all 5 million spots, it would take you 5 years to watch all of those ads back to back without sleeping. Surely it would take longer if you did sleep. And so it would, it's truly amazing. 5 years of content back to back, airing on television in federal races. And that, compared to 2012 up through 2018, is a huge increase in the number of ads that aired on broadcast television stations. So that's what I mean by a record year in spending. Campaigns were spending on other things as well, but they were obviously spending a tremendous amount on television advertising. And so there's a lot for us to pile through. Now, to give us a different sense of this, beyond broadcast television stations, here are some estimates of what we think the campaigns were spending money on, the presidential candidates were spending money on in 2020. And this looks at estimates across different forms of advertising. It goes from April 9th, which is the day after Bernie Sanders dropped out of the Democratic primary. And so it's the day we consider to be the start of the general election, through October 25th. And if you count all of the money that was spent on all of these different venues, you can see at the bottom there, combining both, that Biden and Trump alone spent about $1 billion up to October 25th. And so if you count the numbers through November 3rd, it's over $1 billion that the two campaigns spent alone in advertising to voters. And it doesn't count the efforts of outside groups, which I'll get to in a little while. But what I really find fascinating about these numbers is the difference between the two campaigns in the way they spent money. And also it shows us the rising importance of digital advertising. Because if you went back to 2012 or even to 2016, you would see money spent on digital advertising by Obama's campaign, Clinton's campaign, Trump's campaign, and Romney's campaigns, but not at the scale that we saw in 2020. In fact, Donald Trump spent more on digital advertisements, and these include ads on Facebook, if you've ever seen sponsored posts on Facebook, or ads on Google that might be as a result of a search you make on Google or ads you might see on YouTube. Trump spent over $200 million on those kinds of digital web-based advertisements. And he spent more money doing that than he did on television advertisements. And we've never seen that before in a presidential campaign, except perhaps Trump's campaign in 2016, where he spent very little money on TV and spent a lot of time tweeting and buying a lot of digital advertising. But Biden spent a fair amount of money, and I should say the Trump comparison is with the local broadcast totals. But even if you include these other TV totals, local cable, satellite TV, the Facebook and Google effort is still substantial, almost half of his advertising spending. Biden spent a lot of money on digital as well, about $166 million. But he also spent more money on local broadcast, a significant amount more than Donald Trump, a significant amount more on local cable and on radio. And so this is a breakdown of their spending across these different venues. And it, I think, gives us a sense of how, in fact, campaigns are increasingly diversifying how they reach voters and how expensive these campaign efforts really are. Now, when we, I want to make sure I get the right screen here. When we focus on our TV ads, we spend a good amount of time watching them. I don't watch them all, otherwise I wouldn't have any time because it would take me 5 years to get through them all. But we have people who are trained to watch them and to assess their content. And I want to talk a little bit about the content of ads that aired in 2020 before moving on to some outside group stuff. One of the things that we do and are interested in is tracking how negative campaign ads are. As you all know, and I'll talk about in a minute, the Maine Senate race was very negative. And we quantify negativity by looking at the ads that aired in the race and asking, or at least asking our coders to assess whether the ad primarily mentions the favored candidate. So if it's a Susan Collins ad or a Donald Trump ad, whether they primarily mention or only mention themselves, which we would call a positive ad, whether the ad only mentions the opposing candidate, which we call a negative ad, or whether the ad contains a mention of both candidates, which we call a contrast ad. And this graph shows us the sort of fall campaign efforts of Trump and Biden, as well as their supportive outside groups. We combine all of the efforts of Biden and his outside group allies and Trump and his outside group allies into the totals for this graph. And we stack up the number and percent of ads that aired by week that were positive, negative, or contrast. And so at the top, in the top two panels, those are the airings totals. It shows us how many ads aired in each week, and then it breaks them by the tones of the ad. And you can see over here on the left, in the top left panel, that Biden was always airing more advertisements on broadcast television than Trump. And that is reflected in the graph or the table on the previous slide, where Biden spent more on local broadcast than Trump did. And so there were more Biden ads on TV than there were Trump ads on TV. And then you can see the breakdown there of tone in each week. And Biden and his allies were not overwhelmingly negative. If you count contrast ads as at least containing an attack on Donald Trump, then there was a fair amount of critiques in these ads from Biden. But the vast majority of his ads were either positive messages that promoted his own candidacy or contrast messages that compared Biden's agenda with Trump's. And there was not a lot of negative advertising that was solely devoted to attacking Donald Trump. Now, on the Trump side, there was a little bit of positive advertising, as you can see in the sort of white shaded regions here. The bottom two panels show us the percents, if we want to see the percents, and the top show us the breakdown by the volume, the number of ads that aired. And so Trump did have a fair amount of positive messages, but he was also more negative than Biden. He did much more critiques of Biden than Biden did of Trump, at least in terms of the share of advertising in each week. And it grew over the course of the fall campaign. It became more negative as the campaign progressed. Now, because of Biden's totals, because they're so big and because he was pretty positive for a chunk of the campaign, in fact, actual negativity as a percent of all the ads that aired is a little lower in 2020 than it was in 2016 or in 2012. So it was not a particularly nasty campaign in terms of how we quantify it with these totals. But the unless that I pointed out, or the but that I mentioned on my highlight slide, is that that's true if you think of the percentage of negativity and don't think about the scale, the scope, the volume of advertisements, which were through the roof this election cycle. And so it is also true, even if the campaign was not more negative as a percent, it was more negative as the volume, or as a sort of the number of negative ads on TV was very high, because there was more negative ads, more positive ads, and more contrast ads. There was more of everything. And so as a volume fact, it was very, very negative. But of all the ads that aired, the share of ads that were negative was actually a little smaller in 2020 than it has been in previous presidential elections. That's also true in the Senate side of things. In Senate races in 2020, they were slightly less negative as a percent than previous election cycles. About 40% of all the ads that aired in Senate races in 2020 were negative, and that's a little smaller than the negativity of Senate races in 2018 and 2016 and 2014. So it was not, as a percentage matter, the most negative election cycle. However, as I mentioned, if you look at just the volume totals, there were more negative ads on TV than ever. And that's just a different way to think about the analysis. Now, you know very well that the main Senate race was one of the most negative Senate races in the country, and that was definitely true. Whereas about 40% of all Senate ads were negative. In the main Senate race, sometimes, depending on the week, upwards of 60 or more percent of the ads on TV were negative. And so the main Senate race remains to be one of the most negative Senate races in this election cycle. In some weeks, it was the most negative election in the cycle, if you look at the numbers like you do in this graph week to week. And in other weeks, it might have been number 3 or number 4, but it was consistently in the top 5 in terms of how negative the campaign ads were. And so there's also that to consider, that from race to race, the negativity rates differ. But as an overall matter, it wasn't particularly more negative in terms of the share of negative ads that were on television. Now, they do more than just simply attack. These campaign ads also contain policy positions and statements of goals, policy goals that campaigns want to achieve. And this looks at some summertime advertisements that aired in the presidential election between Biden and Trump, and looks at the number, or at least the percentage, of ads that focused on different issues. And I show this to you because I find the shift here to be kind of interesting to examine. From July to August, at least in the presidential race, Trump was spending a tremendous amount of his advertisements focusing on law and order issues and protests that were happening across the country at the time around the George Floyd murder and civil rights protests that were happening all over the place. And Trump was responding to that by airing advertisements about his opposition to those protests and his opposition to the Defund the Police movement that was on many people's minds at the time. And so crime and protests were a significant portion of his advertisements in the summer. Now, these numbers don't add up to 100 because they add up way past 100, because campaign ads often feature way more than one issue. And so we're just classifying these on the basis of whether they mention the issue or not, and then counting them all up. So many ads mention more than one issue, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 issues. Now, at the time, Biden was not talking about those issues at the same rate. He was talking about COVID and talking about sort of Trump's behavior, actions in that issue, and also his plan for addressing COVID-19. But by the time we got to the end of the campaign, these are ads in the last or a 2-week period in October. And again, we're still coding all of the ads, so we don't have the final few weeks in our data set yet. The campaign emphasis had shifted. Trump was no longer talking about crime as much, nor nearly as much, or about protests and riots. He was instead talking about what you might call bread and butter issues, the taxes, jobs, prescription drugs, healthcare issues. We call it down here infectious diseases, which is really COVID-19. We just sort of relabeled it as we went through the campaign. And his emphasis on law and order issues fell down the list of priorities for Trump, likely because he wasn't getting much bang for his buck there. His poll numbers weren't moving, and so he shifted to talk more about economic issues and his goal of opening up the economy. Biden also shifted a bit away from talking about COVID-19, which was the dominant issue for him in the summer, and focused here too on more issues of economics and healthcare issues and entitlement programs, taxes and the economy and so forth. And so he was more focused on those issues and slightly less on COVID-19. And so you could kind of see from that sort of a transition in the campaign emphasis in the summer to the fall. Obviously, the issue is still deeply important to most voters, but I sense that both candidates perceived voters as wanting to talk about how we were going to move forward, how we were going to give healthcare or manage access to healthcare, and how we were going to open the economy and how we were going to stimulate the economy in the aftermath of COVID. Now, in the main Senate race, it's a little harder to do this too much over time. So what I've done is I've summarized the top two issues for Sara Gideon and Susan Collins in 4 periods of time, from August all the way through October 25th. And there are many, many issues that both campaigns talked about, including COVID-19, but it never rose to the issue of being a top two for them. So if you look down Gideon, the column for Gideon, and this is the percentage of airings that in these time periods that mention these issues. And you can see that an issue of incredible importance for Gideon was on issues of taxes. She spent more time talking about taxes than she did really about any other issue. In the summer, a little bit about business and small businesses. Taxes were her number one issue in the next 2 time periods. In fact, if you count in the September 28th to October 11th period, she was talking about taxes generically and also the Trump tax bill. And so, and then only at the end did she kind of focus more significantly on matters of related to healthcare. But Susan Collins also talked about taxes, top issue in the summer, in the early fall, and into early October, and then at the end a shift to Medicare and jobs. And so one of the things that tells me is this is a summary of a lot of data, of which we can't see all of it very comprehensively, but that it tells me, and I think it conforms with my own sense from watching the ads, that issues of taxes and economic growth and so forth were the top issues in the Senate race in Maine. Now, in other places across the country, COVID was much more important and surfaced to be the top issue. It was a very significant issue in the Senate election in Texas and in Montana and in Kentucky, in particular, primarily because of Mitch McConnell's role as Senate Majority Leader and the race going on there. Now, I haven't done an analysis of what factors predict whether COVID-19 surfaces as a top issue, but it's probably somewhat related to issues that were happening in the state around the spread of the disease, and also the sense that the incumbent may not have done enough to address it or to provide relief to the states. But in Maine, anyway, it was always there as an issue, but not a number 1 or number 2 issue throughout the summer and into the fall campaign. Now, shifting away from the focus on the content of ads, I want to switch back and talk a little bit about the volume of advertisements. And one of the things that's really striking to me in looking at these ads is that throughout the campaign, Democrats across the country spent more money than Republicans. And this was also true in 2018. And in 2018, we sort of thought, well, this is a good sign that spending more money increases your chance of winning. And that's actually, believe it or not, a big debate in political science as to how significantly true that is. Well, in 2020, we see some evidence against that claim. Namely, Democrats spent a tremendous amount more money than Republicans, but they did not win as many races as that would have suggested. So this graph looks at advertisements that aired on television. It's for ads that aired from September through the end of the election. And on the horizontal axis, pro-GOP, it shows the number of ads that were aired on television, broadcast television, in a race. And each of these dots is a race, a House race or a Senate race. And on the vertical axis, it's the number of ads that the Democrats aired. And this is inclusive of all of the people who advertised on behalf of the Democratic or Republican candidates. And then the red diagonal line is the line where if the dot appears on that line, then there were the same number of ads from Democratic sources as there were from Republican sources. And so any dots above the line are races where the Democrats aired more ads than the Republicans. And then I've indicated with the red dot the second congressional district in Maine and the Maine Senate race. And in both cases, the Jared Golden and his allies spent more than Dale Crafts, the Republican in the Maine congressional race, and Sarah Gideon and her allies aired more ads than Susan Collins and her allies. And this is actually true across the campaigns. It's true for most House races, and it's true for most Senate races. Where it's not true tends to be at the bottom end of the scale, where there weren't as many ads aired. We also see here that the Maine Senate race didn't have as many ads as a number of other races, but it had more than a number of others as well. So it's right in the middle, if you will, of the sort of distribution, believe it or not. And this tells us that the money spent on behalf of these Democratic candidates didn't really have as much of an effect maybe as people would have thought. And I can talk a little bit about why I think that's the case. And I think it's the case primarily because Democrats may have been tagged with a set of issue positions that were really hard to counter. And in particular, defund the police was a phrase uttered in many races that, when you think about it, is a crazy thing to want to do if you want to defund the police. In reality, nobody really wants to defund the police except for perhaps the very left end of the political spectrum. Instead, the argument was for shifting resources into social services and to take the burden off of the police of doing many social services. But to counter that argument of defunding the police is very tough. And I think no matter how many ads Democrats aired, having that sort of label attached to their campaign was hard to counter. And so I think many Democrats struggled to counter that argument, and it didn't matter how many ads they aired. It was a very compelling, concise, and persuasive narrative in attacking the Democrats. Democrats also relied heavily on out-of-state spending. They relied a lot on outside groups, and many Democrats raised significant sums of money out of the state or districts that they were in, as many national efforts were mobilized to try to fund Democrats across the country. And it may have also been the case that voters were not super happy that a candidate in their state or district was running advertisements funded with donations from California, Texas, New York, and so forth, and Florida and so forth, and not anywhere near the district or state where the race was happening. And so Democrats had a little bit of a struggle with that as well. So I want to just kind of move towards the conclusion here and raise a couple of other key issues, and then open it up for questions. And there's a few questions here, which I'll start with when I get to it, and then I'll address some others as well. But one of the things that I find really fascinating in this is the role that outside groups play in advertisements. And since 2012, when was the first major election cycle after the Citizens United decision at the Supreme Court, outside groups have come to account for a significant share of advertisements on television. And this looks back to data we have all the way back to 2000. And it counts all of the ads that aired on local broadcast television in the election cycle, and the percentage of those ads that were funded by outside groups. And I define outside groups as not a political party and not a candidate. And so you may have seen many of these outside group advertisements in the Maine Senate race from groups like Senate Majority PAC, Senate Leadership Fund, 1820 PAC, a lot of unions, the National Rifle Association. These are all outside groups. And so in 2020, outside groups accounted for about 1 in every 4 ads on television through the election cycle. And that is not an all-time high, but it is much, much higher than it was in 2010 back to 2000. And it's comparable to the elections of 2012 to 2018, when nearly 30% of the ads aired were outside group sponsored. This is directly an effect of Citizens United, in my opinion, as it opened the doorway for large groups to raise significant sums of money that they funneled into television advertisements. But this is also an underestimate, because in many races, outside group ads are significantly higher than 25%. In the Maine Senate race, for example, from September 8th, which is the day after Labor Day, or September 9th, to the end of the election, about 45% of the ads that aired on television were outside group sponsored. In fact, from September 9th to the end of the election, there were 20 different advertisers on television in the Maine Senate race. There was Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins. There was the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. There was Lisa Savage. So there's 5. And then there were 15 outside groups. Some aired a lot of ads and some aired a few, but 15 outside groups were on the air in the Maine Senate race. And so outside groups are becoming increasingly important to many campaigns, whereas political parties, the formal party organizations, the Democratic Congressional Committee, the Republican Congressional Committee, have shifted their energies away from TV, it seems, and are doing much more things like supporting data analytics for campaigns, candidate recruitment, candidate training, not a lot of TV advertisements, although there were some in the Maine Senate race, not nearly as many as outside group ads. Now, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this next figure, but it's probably one of the ones I find most interesting, which is that outside groups come in many flavors. There's no such thing as a single dominant or sort of overarching type of group. And I like to think of them in terms of their campaign finance classifications. So you could think of groups as being citizen advocacy groups or trade associations or labor unions. I like to think of them in terms of their campaign finance classifications. 501cs are nonprofits, and they are what we oftentimes call dark money groups. They don't disclose their donors to the public. And so this shows us from 2000 to 2020, the profile of advertisers, outside group advertisers in federal races. And the number, the yellow shading is a new type of group called carry PACs, which are basically super PACs that are allowed also to donate money directly to candidates. And so where PACs, the ones that have the thick black outline around the white portion of each bar, are traditional PACs. They make contributions to candidates and do a little bit of advertising now. Carry PACs try to combine that traditional PAC with the super PAC and create what you might call a supersized super PAC, but instead we call them carry PACs because of a court case that legalized them. And they were very irrelevant, largely irrelevant in previous cycles, and have become a little more relevant now, airing about 20% of outside group ads in this last cycle. Super PACs are still dominant, and a little bit of dark money still, direct dark money from these 501cs. And so, I'm happy to talk about this a little bit, but it just shows us, without getting into the sort of weeds of campaign finance, that outside groups come in many different shapes and sizes in terms of how they are funded and how much information they reveal to the public. And so I when I talk about this, I sort of say, I don't think you can really understand modern American elections and how they function and what form they take without, in fact, knowing something about the role that outside groups play in campaigns. From the previous slide, they're increasingly important. And from this slide, we can see that they have many, many different forms. And it's important that we understand, or at least know that, in order to understand how much money is being spent by these organizations across many campaigns. All right, so what next? I'm just going to stop here and make a few points. One is that, moving forward into 2022, I'm going to be interested in seeing how many TV ads there are and whether or not we keep pace with 2020, which would be insane, or whether we'll start to see a decline, a reversion to the mean, if you will. Digital ads will continue to be important. They'll appear online in many different forms, whether they're on social media platforms like Facebook or as a result of our Google searches or YouTube videos that we watch. They'll show up on streaming platforms like Hulu or CBS All Access if we watch those types of networks through smart TVs. I saw a lot of TV ads, or I should say streaming ads, on Hulu this fall in watching some of my favorite programs on my smart TV. And I'd never seen that before. And outside groups will continue to play a big role, and they concern me a little bit because of their efforts online. Outside group efforts online are hard to track, they're hard to classify, and they don't always have to report to the Federal Election Commission. And so they're truly stealth campaigns that could be funded by anybody and anything. And it's hard to know where they are and how extensive their efforts are without some federal mandate that they report spending to the Federal Election Commission. And that's not the case right now for many of these digital ads. So there's a lot of things I'm thinking about and processing for the next election and into the future. And there's a lot to think about, a lot to consider. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to look at some of your questions. And I have a few. And so if others have questions, feel free to add them, and I'll see what I can do to get through them. So one question I got early on in the presentation was, will the current blitz of social media, will the current blitz use of social media for fundraising and ads continue? In other words, we're seeing all these digital advertisements, as I mentioned, and will it continue? And it will. It will continue, and it will go up. Campaigns, in fact, may choose in the future to do less over-the-air free broadcast, not free ads, but free TV for us. We can watch them through antennas, and we don't need to pay a cable package to see these TV channels. Campaigns which have done mostly advertisements on that forum may decide to switch to largely digital forums because fewer and fewer people watch traditional television, live television. In fact, of my students, almost none of them watch TV in traditional ways anymore. They only watch streaming content, videos on YouTube and so forth. And they never watch TV when some program is on television. They always watch it when they want to watch it. And so campaigns are going to have to adjust as most of us shift to that type of media consumption. But right now, many people still watch traditional television. And so it's still a way to reach voters. But with social media, you can do a lot more than just try to persuade people. You can raise a lot of money by advertising in ways that try to solicit fundraising and so forth. And so I think we're going to continue to see that change. To see the jump in 2020 in television advertising on broadcast television is striking because of all the things I just said of what I expect to see. And what it tells me is that campaigns didn't want to leave anything on the table. They wanted to reach as many voters as possible. And so they blitzed television, and they blitzed digital, and they went to radio, and they went in other places wherever they could go. Another question I got was, Maine voters seem to be influenced by the intimidation, says the questioner, that a candidate was an outsider. Does that seem to be true in any or many other parts of the country? I don't know the answer to that question, but I like the question because it allows me to say something about the Maine Senate race and the arguments that were made in that race. So I mentioned it was a very negative race, and I mentioned that there were a lot of outside groups. Well, one of the things I think that was unfortunate as a result of all of that was that I think people, in not necessarily knowing the sort of range in which campaigns or the way we experience campaigns can come from a variety of different advertisers, I think it's at least possible to hypothesize that Sara Gideon was unfairly tagged as being overly negative and as relying on too much out-of-state money. Now, of course, she raised plenty of money from out of state, and she was negative, but there were a lot of outside groups that came in and advertised in the race. And the laws in place do not allow Sara Gideon to coordinate with those groups. So when the Senate Majority PAC, which is a pro-democratic super PAC, comes in and puts millions of dollars in ads on TV attacking Susan Collins, Sara Gideon has absolutely no influence over that. She can't tell them to stop or make them stop, and she has no control over how they pay for those ads. And so to the extent that Senate Majority PAC contributed to an overwhelmingly negative campaign in the state of Maine, it was not Sara Gideon's fault for that. It was the outside groups that decided she was a worthy investment. And so when other groups come in and do the same thing, it was something, again, beyond the control of both Gideon and Collins. The other thing I'll say is that Collins benefited also from many negative advertisements against Gideon and from many advertisements by groups that raised most of their money from out of state. So there was a very simple narrative that emerged over the course of the campaign, particularly perhaps because of the Bill Green ads, that Sara Gideon was unfairly negative against Collins and too reliant on out-of-state donations. Well, in reality, Collins was also very negative, and her allies were too, and they relied also heavily on out-of-state donations. And so it's one of those complicating factors for how we sort of understand the efforts of political advertisers when we have so many different advertisers in a race. I presume Sara Gideon and Susan Collins would have preferred to have all the money that was spent by outside groups in their own campaign coffers, and they could have run the campaign they wanted to run, but they had to run campaigns amid all of these other advertisers who were saying all the things they wanted to say. And it made it really hard for both candidates to have control over the narrative of the campaign, the agenda of the campaign, the issues in the campaign. I mentioned that Gideon and Collins focused primarily on, or a lot on, taxes. Other outside groups were advertising on COVID and on other issues. And it may have been the case that if both candidates controlled all the money and did all the advertising, that voters would have seen less of a lot of issues and more of a lot of other issues. And that's something that I think is a downside of all of these advertisers, is candidates lose control over the narratives that surround these elections. In terms of being an outsider, absolutely. I mean, this is, I think, a very interesting Maine dynamic. There's always claims of carpetbagging that can happen across other states and other campaigns, and being a sort of true Mainer versus a true a Floridian or something is always important in these states. But in Maine, it seems to take on a particular importance. Another question was asked: do you have a way to tell how many people pay attention to the ads and or whether they move voters? It's a good question, because I'm talking a lot about all of these advertisements, and I haven't said a word about their impacts. The only thing I've said is that Democrats spent more and didn't win more. And so that tells us a little bit about their limited impact. But one of the things we don't know a lot of, and I'll say we know a lot of this and we know a little of over here, and what we know very little of is, in fact, how many people are paying attention to the TV ads. We've studied this for many, many years, but we don't have great metrics over how many people have seen the ads. It's not totally true, because most ads air during local news broadcasts, and those have pretty good ratings relative to other shows on TV. And so we know more people are seeing them than if they aired during, during the middle of the day, a soap opera or something. However, we don't know if they're paying attention to those ads when they come on. Some of us change the channel, we go in the other room. This is a universal problem with advertisements on television. But we have good evidence that if you air ads on television, it does seem like it can influence your poll numbers and your election results, notwithstanding the 2020 point I made. And so ads do seem to have some influence, but the effects are pretty small. And we're never really sure if they're going to make a big impact because of the question, we never know how much people are paying attention to them or how sick of these messages people might be. And so TV is always a sort of strange environment where it's a great way to reach people, but we're never totally sure how many people are paying attention. On Facebook, the other side of it is that when campaigns advertise on Facebook, they get great metrics because Facebook knows if you click on the ad, they know if you've expanded the text to read the ad, they know if you've clicked on the video to watch the video, if there's a video. They know a lot about what the users on their platform do when they see a message in their newsfeed. And so we get really good estimates of what are called impressions with Facebook ads. And you can look to see which ads a candidate puts on Facebook that have the most impressions. And so campaigns use this a lot to experiment with what is a really good or not a very impactful message. And that's very different from TV. So with TV, you kind of put stuff on television, you hope your poll numbers move if you're doing polling, and then that's it. With Facebook, though, you instantaneously know if your messages are bringing in more donations or if there are more people who are watching the ad than a different type of ad that you might put up. And then you can play around and experiment with ads to try to find the ones that have the biggest bang for their buck. At the end of the day, though, all this advertising really doesn't move a lot of numbers. So much of our politics is determined in part by our partisanship and how we view the parties and how interested we are in politics. And we're pretty adept at choosing to ignore information or choosing to discount information or choosing to sort the information we care about and think about. And so as a result, they don't change a lot of minds and they don't certainly convince people to switch sides, but they can make an impact and they can have modest effects. And that's really all that matters to a candidate that is in a close race. And so if you're running for the United States Senate and polls say you're locked at a 48-48 race and there's a small number of undecideds, it doesn't really matter that your ads only influence 1 or 2% of the vote because that's what's going to decide the winner. And so you put a lot of money into that 1 or 2% and the other side's doing the same thing and everybody's fighting over that small share of the vote. And that determines the winners and the losers. And that's why we see all the money that we see. It's ironic. We see so many ads. They're meant for all of us, but in reality, they're really trying to speak to the few numbers of people who are persuadable. So we do have a few more minutes in case anyone wants to ask another question.
Hey, Mike, maybe I could step in with a quick question.
Sure.
It's Tom Porter again here. Given what you learned from the elections we've just had, perhaps you could talk a little bit more, I know you've touched on it, about the future and what 2022 might look like and beyond even.
Thanks, Tom. And so, yeah, so in terms of what we expect to see in the future, one, in 2022, we'll have less advertisements just by virtue of having less, no presidential race. And so that will keep things, lower than this cycle, thankfully. But we'll have plenty of ads in House races and in competitive Senate races because both chambers will be up for grabs. The House is so close now with Democratic seat losses from this cycle, and the Senate will either be 50-50 or 52-48. And so it will be a very, very competitive cycle. And so we should see a lot more advertisements just by virtue of that. TV, at some point, TV will tip. TV will hit the plateau and it will tip. And we'll see less of it because there's simply less people watching that venue. But I don't know if that'll happen in 2022, given that so many political advertisers believed that TV, traditional broadcast television, was still very important in 2020. We shouldn't see the light switch off on that in 2022. So I think we'll see plenty of those ads, and we'll see a lot more digital ads. And as these platforms expand and allow more and more campaigns to reach people in more and more different types of ways, we'll see ads on all of these places. And not all of these places are easy to track the advertisement efforts. So So I would normally have said by 2022, we'll see less TV ads on broadcast television. But I don't think that we're going to see that sort of off the cliff dive of numbers yet. We'll still see a lot given how deeply competitive the chamber, House and Senate will be in that cycle. We did have one final question, one other question. I want to answer that. And then I will be the one who sign us off and say thank you for coming. And my apologies at the beginning on the mute button. I think in my own mind, as I was reflecting on as my moving around to click on the screen share, I think I may have inadvertently hit the mute button as I was trying to move around the little things that were blocking my view. So thanks for alerting me to that. And clearly, I still need to perfect my my remote approach. But so the question was that do you think Susan Collins would have won without spending so much money? I do. I think that there is a narrative coming out of the campaign that there was too much money and that turned voters off, and that many voters were turned off by Sara Gideon's the extensive efforts on behalf of Sara Gideon, including her ads and ads from outside groups and so forth. And there was actually a New York Times article that interviewed some Mainers that argued that the tipping point, there was too much money, and if there had been a lot less money, voters would have been pleased. But in general, everybody always complains that there's too much money, and if there was only 30 million each instead of $100 million in spending, we would have complained about that too. I think what actually hurt Sara Gideon and was actually very successful for Susan Collins was less the amount of money and more the narratives, more the sort of arguments that were made. I'm not really good at dissecting campaign strategies, sort of day-to-day strategies and what Sara Gideon should have done differently. But my initial impression is that the ads by Bill Green were very successful, very persuasive at conveying a very simple narrative. And that as long as those messages were there, Sara Gideon was going to face a tough response. And it was not unlike Democrats across the country who had to suffer against a very simple and compelling frame that they wanted to defund the police, or that they were socialists, or that they were from away. And combating those messages, which are simple, concise, is oftentimes very tough. Sometimes the Democrats have that narrative. In 2018, they hammered home healthcare. They focused on that issue across the country. It was a very simple issue. We're better on it than Republicans. Trump is trying to take away healthcare. We want to give you healthcare. It was successful. Trump was unpopular. That message was simple, and it worked. This time around, the defund the police and outside money is trying to buy your vote were very persuasive messages. And so even if you keep those messages and reduce the volume of reduce the number of ads that aired, but you still keep those messages in front of voters, I think it was still an advantage for Susan Collins. What I need to figure out as a final point is how the polling got that wrong, because the polling suggested that Sara Gideon was likely to win, and we all went into Election Day thinking that was a likelihood. And in fact, it didn't turn out very close to what the poll suggested. And so there's something else that was happening as well that didn't allow us to pick up that trend. So I think that's a good place to stop. And again, I appreciate your comments and spending time with me today and putting up with the mute problem. And I hope that the data and the information was enough to stimulate some thoughts. And I would be happy to see you all at some point in the future where we could have cookies and coffee, because that's always a good thing to have. So thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your day.